Hello, my name is Kaitlyn McGann. I'm an intern here at the Western Museum of Mining and Industry, working under our curator, Dr. Rick Sauers. I have a bachelor's degree in Egyptology from the University of Liverpool, and today I will be talking about mining in ancient Egypt. I will begin by talking about the minerals that were mined, the ancient Egyptian mining strategies, and looking at a few specific mines that shed light on the ancient Egyptians' relationship with mining. Real quickly, I'm going to give a layout of ancient Egyptian history and the time periods that I will be talking about during the presentation. This is a timeline with rough dates and correlations of the historic ages that occurred at the same time. We have the early dynastic period in the early Bronze Age beginning around 3000 BC, and then the Old Kingdom in Egypt, which is the time when the Great Pyramids were made. After that, we have our first intermediate period, which is a time where there was no central king in Egypt, and so it's a little shakier in kind of the central power. After that, we have the Middle Kingdom, which lasts for about 500 years. After this time, the central control is lost again for a second intermediate period, and then finally, the countries are united again in the last golden age of Egypt, the New Kingdom, which is where popular Egyptology comes from, like King Tut and the Valley of the Kings. The third intermediate period coincides with the fall of the Bronze Age and is very undocumented time in Egypt and is when the Iron Age starts. The late period is the last period in which Egyptians rule Egypt, and they are later taken over by the Persians, who are taken over by the Greeks and the Romans, bringing the Greco-Roman period for the last 600 years or so. Mining was important throughout ancient Egypt and gives us a lot of evidence left behind in the archaeological record. Many of the first things that come to mind when discussing ancient Egypt exist because of mining and quarrying, from the Great Pyramids to centimeter-sized amulets. The Egyptians mined metals and precious stones and quarried a variety of both hard and soft stones. Mining expeditions took a lot of planning and hard work. These treks could take months to complete, where the workmen would need to sleep, have food, and water. Some of the groups could even be up to 1,000 people, with many of the mines having settlements and being driven by the elite society who could actually pay for all of these resources to go to foreign countries and bring back material. First, I will talk about metals. Copper was the most common metal used in ancient Egypt, used for vessels, tools, weapons, jewelry, mirrors, everything, common for not only the elites but also everyday people. Copper was also the first mineral that was mined in Egypt, with evidence of copper tools coming from the pre-dynastic period, so that period before 3000 BC. Initially, copper would have been obtained from entirely surface deposits, extracting the ore with simple flint tools on the surface. Later, they would be able to use the copper tools that they'd created from these surface deposits to cut shafts following the veins to get even more copper. Originally, copper was heated and hammered into shape, but they later learned that it could be poured into molds and shaped to make stronger tools and weapons, sometimes hammered and tempered to make them even stronger. During the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptians learned how to create bronze, either by an accident while working with copper or learning from techniques in Asia. Either way, the Egyptians began working bronze around 2000 BC. They quickly learned that bronze was stronger than copper and a lot easier to mold, as copper can contract when cooling, so it became the most common metal used for New Kingdom's Egyptians and later on. Bronze was fashioned in the same way as copper, but was already stronger and melted at a lower temperature, making it easier to cast. Gold is another metal that was mined very early in Egyptian history, being found in pre-dynastic tombs. Most of the gold mining for Egypt was done in Nubia or the Eastern Desert. As most cultures, Egyptians started with alluvial gold mining, washing sand and gravel with running water, leaving the heavier gold pieces behind. The smaller pieces would then be fused into smaller ingots to create the bigger pieces we see today. Eventually, they began using tools to get gold out of the quartz rock, and the mining techniques were recorded by the Greeks during the Greco-Roman period. They said that the Egyptians first began with cracking the rock with fire and then using hammers and picks. Once the rock was broken, it was carried outside of the mine and crushed by stone mortars into even smaller pieces. These small pieces were broken down into powder by hand mills. Water was then used to separate the gold, very similar to how our stamp mill at the mining museum works still. The gold would be melted down into ingots and then later shaped by hammering and casting. Gold could also be engraved or embossed and was often hammered into extremely thin sheets to create a golden foil that could cover ordinary objects with precious metals, making it easier to have a golden object that didn't need to be solid gold. Silver was also mined early on in Egyptian history during the pre-dynastic period, but it was extremely rare. Silver was actually rarer than gold in ancient Egypt and therefore worth more. The origins of silver are more elusive than the other metals, as there so far has never been native silver nor silver ore found in Egypt. Silver also does not fare well in ancient Egyptian tombs, often affected by corrosive salts, and therefore harder to study in the archaeological record. Not much is known with how they would have worked silver, but it was likely similar to gold. We know for a fact that they did hammer it into thinner sheets, and we have few examples of silver-plated objects and objects with a silver foil covering. Iron comes into Egyptian history rather late, likely due to the fact that it is a harder metal to work with. Although there are early examples of iron in Egypt, many of them have been tested and have been proven to be meteoric iron, which means that they might not have known how to actually work the iron and were just taking it from a meteor that had already landed instead of going to find the ore and getting it out of the ground. After the New Kingdom, iron was slowly being worked more and more. Iron had to be hammered extremely hot and handled hammers. So the Egyptians were not able to really grasp working with iron until later, with the first evidence of iron tools coming from the late period. But iron did not become commonly used until the Greco-Roman period. There are many precious stones that were used throughout ancient Egyptian history, but today I'm going to focus on the mines for amethyst and turquoise because we have more information about the mines themselves. Amethyst was very popular during the Middle Kingdom. The mines at Wadi el-Hudi were exploited during this period and later in the Roman period. It is a very large area with multiple mines and settlements, with inscriptions that help us determine when it was in operation. Here they used granite hammerstones to break apart the rock and get to the quartz veins that contained the amethyst. There is also evidence that metal tools were used. Because the amethyst was found in granite bedrock, it is likely iron being used to extract the amethyst during the Roman period. The amethyst could not be seen from the surface, but the ore could, so the miners would dig giant pits following the visible vein, creating an open cast quarry. This picture is one example, but the waste heaps that were along the sides of the mine have filled in the area due to rainstorms over the couple thousand years since they were last worked. Once the quartz containing amethyst were extracted, they would be taken to the settlements and further chipped down until the piece only contained the raw amethyst. It would then be sent to a royal workshop where it could be further refined. Turquoise was one of the most common precious stones in ancient Egypt, being found as early as the Neolithic period around 6,500 years ago, and continuing on in use until the Roman period. One of the major mines producing turquoise was Serabit el-Qadim, a sign located in Sinai. These specific mines were exploited for over 1,000 years, and the people who worked here left behind many inscriptions discussing what they were doing at this site. Many stelae were set up commemorating the king and the expeditions, talking about when they were opening the new galleries. To get the turquoise, a vein would be found on the side of the rock, and then they would dig horizontally into the rock, creating caverns. The strata enabled for fairly large sections without much need of support. Since the bedrock was sandstone, the terraces could have been mined with copper and later bronze tools. The extracted turquoise would have been sent to a workshop. Once mined, these precious stones would have been transported to a workshop, likely a royal workshop. They would have been manufactured into amulets, beads, and really anything that had been requested. Each person would have a different job. Some would take the rough materials and roll them over a block covered with sand and water until they were smooth to create small, smooth beads, and others would use drills to make holes for the beads, while another would string them onto the necklace or the collar, and then you would get your final product. Next, I will be talking about the hardstone mining. Hardstone mining was done with stone tools from the pre-dynastic period to the late period. Originally, these tools would have been handheld, and with a majority being made of dolerite. Larger two-handed stone tools were also used for pounding corners or edges to get smaller pieces of rock, or to create trenches and undercuts to get larger pieces out of the bedrock. By the late period, iron tools began to be used like hammers and picks. Another innovation that came during the Ptolemaic period that is still used today is where many holes are drilled into a straight line, and then a hammer and chisel are used along the line until the rock splits. This is an example of an obelisk in Aswan that was supposed to be 137 feet long, but cracked when they were creating it. But along the sides you can see human-sized trenches that you could fit in that they had dug to be able to get the obelisk out. Hardstone was shaped by hammering and grinding using even harder stones and sand. They also used drills with an abrasive for shaping or hollowing out hardstone objects to create vessels or inscriptions. The finished object was polished with a rubbing stone to make it smooth. Hard stones were typically not painted. Black dolerite was one of the most popular stones, used for its color black, which is a symbol of the Nile and rebirth in Egypt. Other rocks, such as granite and quartzite, were also used for their colors to represent different aspects that the owner wanted to portray, with rocks that had browns or yellows being used to depict more solar connections. Next, I'll be talking about soft stones. Limestone is one of the most prevalent stones that was quarried in ancient Egypt. Soft stones were primarily quarried with copper and later bronze chisels and picks. Trenches would be cut on 3 sides of the stone with picks, and then the rock was undercut and detached with a chisel pounded by a wooden mallet. Once iron came around, it was used instead of the bronze and copper, but the style of quarrying remained unchanged. A majority of quarrying was done open face, but it's also common for limestone to be quarried or carved into the side of a mountain or hill, creating a cave-like room using unquarried areas to hold up pillars in the room. These are often called galleries and are similar to what you can see in the Valley of the Kings, where the tombs were cut into the limestone bedrock. Limestone quarrying was popular until around 1500 BC, with the most important buildings being made of limestone like the pyramids. A majority of the limestone was local, so a lot of the limestone for the Great Pyramids came from an area directly near the Great Pyramids. For the finer quality limestone, expeditions would have been sent, and so those would have been the higher elites and even the encasings of the pyramid to show a higher status than just the generic nearby limestone. When the New Kingdom began around 1500 BC, the Egyptian capital moved from its northern location to the south, modern-day Luxor. In northern Egypt, the limestone practically meets the Nile, making it a practical stone for quarrying and use for nearby building projects. Near Luxor, sandstone becomes the more common and easily accessible stone. The Egyptians had already been using sandstone previously, but now it was more accessible, and they became more familiar with it. Working it and eventually learning that it was stronger and sturdier, which allowed them to build temples bigger than they had previously, bringing us some of the best still standing Egyptian temples today. Egyptian alabaster, which is actually travertine, was very common, used for flooring, shrines, figurines, sarcophagi, and more, different than the uses of limestone and sandstone, which were usually used for building purposes or bigger stelae. This Egyptian alabaster is a type of limestone and is quarried in a very similar way, including having some known underground workings. The main reason I address Egyptian alabaster is the question I get asked most when I tell people I study Egyptology, is wondering if the aliens built the pyramids. 2 years ago, one of my professors was working at this Egyptian alabaster quarry called Hatnub, which is located around the middle of Egypt. He worked on texts discovering that these quarries would have been used in a similar time to the Great Pyramids. On their most recent dig, archaeological evidence was found to give a glimpse into how the bigger rocks that could have been used for things like the pyramids would have been moved. You can see the ramp here, along with stairs on either side, and there are also giant post holes. The giant quarry stones from any quarry would have been taken out on a sled and pulled by a group of people. This quarry had a specifically high incline, and so the steps and post holes would have been used to create a pulley to get the stone on the sled out of the quarry, proving that the ancient Egyptians did have the skill set to move large stones to create the pyramids. Soft stones were very common stones and easily shaped using copper chisels and stone tools. Like hard stone, some of the stones, like this example of Egyptian alabaster, were kept unpainted for color. But often, the limestone or sandstone, which were lighter in color, would have been covered in plaster and painted over. Tombs were especially decorated this way. I hadn't looked into Egyptian mining until I decided to give this talk, but I quickly learned that Egyptian mining can give us a lot of information. Some of the mines that have settlements can give us a lot of information on the social hierarchy in the villages, both inside of Egypt and also their relations with foreigners in foreign countries for mining. It also shows how important minerals were for status. A lot of the wealthier people could afford to get higher status minerals from these and from the king, whereas the poorer residents would often use typical clay, and they could paint it, trying to make it look like these minerals, showing their higher status, including bowls that look painted to like they have inclusions in them or just have the speckled colors of granite. It also showed me that many artifacts actually would not exist without mining. Metals, soft stones, precious stones, hard stones, all would have to come from mining. And so temples, pyramids, amulets, coffins, all of this had to come from somewhere, and mining and quarrying was the way that we got it. Even today, Egyptian mining can still help people. A lot of the companies mining in Egypt use the ancient Egyptian mines as indicators to figure out where they could find the best veins. Thank you. If you have any questions or would like to hear more about this topic, feel free to reach out to us at the museum.